mais de 68 milhões de pessoas já foram obrigadas a deixar seus países de origem por causa de guerra, fome, desastres ambientais, perseguição política ou religiosa, segundo a Acnur, até 2018. Só entre 2014 e 2018, mais de 30 mil migrantes morreram em travessias irregulares. Esse é o maior número de deslocamentos forçados já registrados pela Agência da ONU de Refugiados em 70 anos de atuação. Para falar sobre esse tema, a gente conversa agora com Gammeltoft Hansen, PhD em Direito Internacional pela Universidade de Aarhus, na Dinamarca. Ele veio ao Brasil para participar do Seminário das Cátedras Sergio Vieira de Melo, uma iniciativa da Agência da ONU para Refugiados, que inclui 22 instituições de ensino superior, entre elas a PUC-Rio. So, what are the impact of the mass migrating movements?
I mean, we can, of course, first of all, talk about the impact on migrants themselves. I mean, there's few things that are so fundamentally disruptive as being forced to flee from your home, whether you're internally displaced or whether you're an international refugee. But of course, it goes without saying that there are also deep impacts on the states that receive refugees and the host communities in which they live. And that can be anything from of course, economic impacts, not necessarily negative, but in the initial phase, there's typically a need for international assistance, and it's going to be hard for some of the big refugee hosting countries to lift that job alone. On a slightly more longer, or sort of you could say, mid-term or long-term thing, well, many refugees also contribute positively to local economies, to politics, and these other things.
Where do these migrating movements take place, and where are the most popular destinations?
If we look around the globe, and if you look at current migration patterns more globally, well, the first thing to remember is that the vast majority, I mean the overwhelming majority, nearly 2/3 of all displaced persons are internally displaced, meaning that they fled to another place within their own country. They haven't crossed an international border. If we then sort of move on and look at refugees, which is what's been talked about a lot these years, well, indeed, 85% of all refugees globally are hosted in low and middle income countries, i.e. generally countries in the global south, like Brazil.
There is a growing trend of xenophobia and as well shutting down borders, as we can see in Europe. How does it influence in the humanitarian crisis?
The essence of any crisis is kind of a breakdown of the ordinary political, economic, social systems. The crisis that we had in Europe in 2015 and 16 related to asylum seekers was not really a crisis of numbers. There was a big increase in the number of asylum seekers to about 1.2 million in a single year. But in a region of 500 million people, that shouldn't be impossible to handle. Just think about how many Brazil has received from Venezuela within the last few years. Now, this crisis was perhaps much more actually a sort of political crisis in terms of, well, how should we deal with this? There was a breakdown of trust across the different European member states, and there was a breakdown of respect for the general rule of law. And I think that is very symptomatic. We see that in other regions as well, that in sort of within this sort of notion of crisis language, you can produce and mobilize more xenophobic political streams. And that is being done, sadly, by more populist leaders in different parts of the world.
How can United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights interfere in the refugees' legal and social rights without interviewing the sovereignty of the country?
You could say that these two organizations that you mentioned are very, very different. But common for them is that they relate to international legal instruments, the American Human Rights Convention, and for the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. And that gives them a legal platform. These are instruments that each state, or most of the states that they work in, have signed on to, have ratified. So they've committed themselves to respect international law in this regard. And hence, of course, when the Inter-American human rights system engages in migration and refugee issues, it does so with the backing of a system, a legal system that states have signed up to themselves that they should respect. For UNHCR, the situation is a little bit different, but of course UNHCR is not a court. and it doesn't have the legal power that the Inter-American Human Rights Commission does. But even then, UNHCR tries to advocate for refugee rights. It's also trying to help basically solve the more practical issues surrounding refugee reception. So a very big part of their activities today relate to helping set up reception centers, distribute food aid, try and organize things like education, healthcare, etc. And those are things that UNHCR does with the invitation of these countries. So I don't think there is a big sovereignty problem in this regard. All these things happen within that context. What can be difficult, of course, is that when you have organizations like UNHCR that are so vested in this sort of practical refugee work, it's hard because they need the accept of these states to enter, to take a step back and say, well, your government is really not living up to these international legal standards that they have signed on to. So there are sort of different roles at play. And in that sense, it's good to have the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which has a long track record of taking on important cases regarding migrants' rights.
The borders of the Gaza Strip are known for disrespect the human rights. How would it be possible for international organizations guarantee the human rights in these places and borders?
Yeah, see, this is where we come to the problem of sovereignty, because without an invitation to come in and without the sort of active cooperation of either the legitimate state and or the occupying power in this case, well, there are only limited opportunities in that regard. And I mean, the reason I think we have the long-standing problem in the Gaza is of course also due to the fact that there is dispute around this, that the Israeli state doesn't freely allow international organizations to help out and to operate, and that exactly this problem of sort of securing access versus holding states to account for these human rights violations is sometimes not an easy thing to do at once. So I'm afraid as long as we live in the kind of world we do, which is built around sovereign states, there's going to be limited opportunities in situations where that will isn't there. Of course, that's not unique for the Gaza Strip, even though it might be one of the most well-known cases. There are other areas around the world where these sort of territories are disputed, or where states simply say, well, we don't want to let any of these international organizations in. The UNHCR was rejected access to help Rohingya refugees in Asia. We've seen similar cases where human rights organizations and UN organizations have been denied access to carry out inspection reports, to do monitoring visits, to report on migrant rights, not just in the global south, but increasingly, sadly, also now in many global north countries. So this is a challenge that needs to be addressed, and to sort of refoster the commitment of these states. Say, well, you have yourself signed on to these legal instruments. Without the Refugee Convention, without the Inter-American Human Rights System, many things would fall apart. In all likelihood, you would be seeing even more refugees, because as of now, you all depend on other states also living up to these standards in terms of hosting refugees in order for them not to have to move on once again, or even more refugees to be created. So I do think it's in these states' enlightened self-interest, but there's certainly a, you could say, pedagogical task ahead of us in terms of explaining it to governments around the world.
The Supreme Court of the United States accepted a request by Donald Trump to limit immigrant asylum requests on Mexico's border. What are the impacts on Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras borders with Mexico, the country that serves as a route to the United States?
In fact, there's been a decade or maybe even two of cooperation between the United States and Mexico and other states in Central America to try and stop migrants moving on. And this latest measure, the limitation on being able to apply for asylum at the border, can be seen as an extension of these already existing policies. Now, of course, the immediate effect will be on asylum seekers who are then denied the possibility to apply for asylum at the border. In my clear opinion, from the perspective of international law, this is not only a violation of the non-refoulement principle. You can't simply deny asylum seekers access in that manner. Certainly you can't require them to have applied for asylum in a number of other states before you then take them. The United States is bound by the Refugee Convention by the moment that these people stand on their border. The other thing, of course, is you could question the internal logic from a political perspective of this new rule. I mean, what the scheme does is to say, well, it's only asylum seekers who've applied for asylum in a number of other countries on the way, and in each of them been rejected, that can then apply for asylum in the United States. If what the United States wanted was more genuine refugees, well, that's a pretty bad policy to only then allow those that have been actually rejected elsewhere to apply in your own country. This is, you could say, quite a dramatic turn from the US, and something that I think will have a big impact on both the migration patterns, but certainly and most importantly on the refugees, the genuine refugees that have been counting on getting access to asylum.
Thank you for your time. Julia Gerstenson para a TV PUC-Rio.